pretty big team of observers actually, and my role has been the easiest part, just I guess managing some of the data and not really getting my feet wet as often as I wish I could, I guess. But nevertheless, my co-authors on this paper include Amy Wolf, who is teaching an ecology class right now, and her students have been involved with restoration work at Point Sable. Nick Walton, who's been, I put them in order of their longevity in working on this project, and Nick has been working at Point Sable for, gosh, almost a decade, I suspect. Erin Giese will talk about her specific work a little bit later. Stephanie Bielke, who is working there now, and Tom Presby, who is also working there now. So my plan here is to begin with the story of this place. I believe it qualifies as a full-service hotel in Dave's scheme. And I'm going to really describe the history of the site and get you a sense of what this place is all about and how it came into conservation protection. And then I'm going to describe some data that have been collected at Point Sable over more than a decade. And that will be a somewhat technical part of the presentation. We're really just beginning to look at some of these results, but I think they're quite interesting, and I hope to have some generalizations about patterns of bird distributions, both spatially and temporally, at a place like this. So let's begin with the basics here about where we're talking about the place. We're going to be talking about Point Sable. I'll have a bigger picture of this in just a minute. But it's located about 6 miles from where we are right now, maybe 5 miles from where we are right now, along the east shore of Green Bay. The west shore of Green Bay, of course, is famous for its wetlands. Because of the geology of this region, there tend to be many more extensive wetlands along this shore. The bedrock comes closer to the surface here. The weathering patterns have been different. There are very few wetlands on the east shore of Green Bay. But this is the biggest of them, and it's hence an important place that combines a mosaic of habitats, as I'll describe here shortly. Next slide. Probably the most significant, or one of the most significant features of this particular site is it's an important promontory here extending into the bay. Next slide. But perhaps most importantly is it's only about 3 miles from the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay campus. So it has received a great deal of attention, and I hope that it will continue to receive a great deal of attention and study for decades and who knows, maybe centuries. But it's very conveniently placed for our campus, and it's already provided some wonderful opportunities for our students to experience a substantial natural area just almost on our doorstep. Next slide. So let me just say a few things about the history of Lower Green Bay and this particular site. Some of this history is relevant, I think, to an understanding of the dynamics of this place. So we're not very far from the place where Jean Nicolet in 1634 landed and eventually established Wisconsin's first city, or he and others established Wisconsin's first city in Green Bay. And Lower Green Bay for many years was an important site of commerce for the fur trade. It had already been, even before 1634, an important place for people. So Point Sable has been influenced by people, and it still is influenced by people. It's seen many changes over these centuries. Next slide. So from the 1600s until the 1800s, trapping was the major enterprise of people, or Europeans anyway, in this region. And Green Bay fortuitously was an outpost, and I'm sure that Point Sable was visited by trappers and has been visited, as I mentioned, by people for centuries. Okay, next slide. Now, we know from the early accounts of the French explorers dating all the way back to the 1600s that this wasn't an important place for migratory birds, especially waterfowl. We don't have any accounts of warbler point counts or anything back in the time of Nicolet and Marquette and those people. I wish they had done, but anyway, they didn't. But we do have some first-hand accounts of waterfowl. And here's a statement that came from the diary of Joliet and Marquette. They said that the bay was full of bustards, ducks, teal, and other birds attracted there by the wild oats. There are no bustards here. Presumably they meant bitterns or herons or large wading birds, I guess. But it was an impressive place, impressive enough to be mentioned in these diaries going all the way back to the 1600s. Next slide. So, well, I should point out this map, by the way. This is a map, the most detailed map that I've been able to find, going back before the time when Europeans really settled in the area. But here's Point Sable here. Green Bay is here. Here's the Fox River, and you can see that there were already farms and settlements along this region. And in fact, we suspect that the vegetation, we know that the vegetation, the earliest vegetation here, was not the typical hardwood hemlock forest or beech maple hemlock forest that's typical of this region. There were predominantly oaks and relatively open habitats when the area was first surveyed in the mid-1800s. So probably native people had been using this area and modifying the landscape significantly before it was actually formally surveyed in the mid-1800s. Anyway, by the late 1800s, the market hunters had realized that Lower Green Bay was a good place to hunt, and it became a rather famous place for waterfowl hunting. Again, taking advantage of this I guess, concentration of birds, large birds that use this area. And Point Sable surely was a part of that culture of waterfowl hunting, even back before we have records. Again, by the early 1900s, when conservation measures were put into place, Green Bay had already been firmly established as an important place for migratory birds, specifically waterfowl. Okay, next slide. Now, in the late 1800s, the point came into private ownership. This is the oldest map that we've been able to find that actually has a name associated with the place. What I'd like you to notice in the next several slides that are going to come up here is not the property boundaries, but I'd like you to pay attention to the outline of the point. So you know, what will eventually be UW Green Bay is down here. The city of Green Bay is down there. We're looking north, heading up to Door County. Interestingly, the road looks like it was already well established back in the late 1800s. But watch the various changes, perhaps due to inaccurate mapping. But I think you'll see that some of these changes represented genuine changes in the configuration of land at Point Sable. Next slide. Okay, so here's 1935 image, and we have here channel, an inlet that leads to some kind of a body of a lagoon, a body of water that also connects with the bay at the north end, the northwest end, and creates almost an island out here. Different owner now at this point, but in looking at these old plat maps, change is the rule. This is a dynamic place, the point that I really want to help impress you with about this from these diagrams. Next slide, Bill. Thank you. Okay, so in the 1960s, we start seeing, actually somewhat prior to that time, but we start seeing familiar names on the plat maps. And one prominent name is John Rose, who was a local businessman here. And he and a group of colleagues acquired that property and used it as a hunting camp. So they carried on the tradition of waterfowl hunting at the point. And then the property next to Rose is the Gauthier family, and their name will come up again in a few minutes here as well. Next slide. So, skipping ahead a couple of decades, this piece of property became available. It was owned by neither of the Gauthiers or the Roses, who, this is the Rose property out here, and the Gauthier property is here. But this property became available, and through the foresight of Peter McKeever and the Nature Conservancy, that piece of property, about 55 acres, was acquired in 1992. A second piece was purchased next to that a year later, and that eventually was donated to University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. Next slide. Then in the late 1990s, 1996, John Rose, who was the last survivor of that group of duck hunters at the point, he was retired, and he wanted to see that place protected. It's never had a permanent dwelling on it. There's been a network of rough roads used for access for hunting, but it's essentially a wild place in that respect. And he donated the point, 58 acres of it, to the Nature Conservancy, who then donated it to UW Green Bay. So that's where we were in 2002. Next slide. And then just a couple of years ago, one of the, one of the Gauthier members, one of the members of the Gauthier family, wanted to sell their piece of the property for a nest egg in retirement. And so we worked out an arrangement where we split the property, which was jointly owned by the heirs of the Gauthier, the earlier Gauthier family. And we worked out an arrangement whereby this piece of property was acquired by the university with help from NRDA funds and help from the Coffran Foundation at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay. And then we acquired another little piece that gives us a parking area through a gated road here. And then we also acquired a piece along the road, which gives us access to Weequahic Creek, which runs out into the property. And that's where we are today. That mosaic of properties is what's now officially designated as the Point Au Sable Nature Preserve, consisting of almost 200 acres. Now, okay, so that's the history of the site. Now I'd like to describe the place itself, which, again, as I mentioned, really qualifies as a full-service migratory stopover, I think. The habitats are varied and dynamic. And you'll see in the next series of slides what I mean by dynamics. So this image is taken from an air photo probably in 2010. And I'll go through each of these habitats next after I've emphasized the point about this dynamic mosaic. Okay, next one. All right, so we have, I guess I'll come back to the dynamics later. We'll talk about the habitats first. So one of the most prominent features, the most impressive feature that I remember when I first visited Point Sable is this lagoon. This was back in, I guess, 1992 when Peter McKeever took me out here. We walked along here, and when we got to that lagoon, it was like a cloud of waterfowl that ducks and geese and it was just really impressive. I'll never forget seeing that. At any rate, at that point, this lagoon was mostly filled with water. You can see this picture was taken during the summer, so you've got some algae there at the surface, but the habitat here is quite wet. So that lagoon is a major feature that attracts water birds, some breeding wetland species, and of course ducks and geese when there's water there. Next slide. Now there is also upland forest, but it's not large forest interior upland forest. But nevertheless, it's important for migratory birds. We have this sort of open woodland out near the point, and then we have oak woods that extends along the shore here in these sandy soils and along these finger-like ridges that extend out into the wetland. So we have a wetland, we have upland forest adjacent to that wetland. Next slide. Then in the north end of the property, the first piece that was acquired has an extensive area of primarily lowland forest that's flooded typically during the spring. Insect larvae are hatching from that place. It's a wonderful resource for migratory birds. Next slide. Then we have some complex and unfortunately invaded habitats as well. There's a wet meadow that extends here and to in various forms out toward the creek itself, the Wequiock Creek corridor. Next slide. Whoops, skip that one. I already talked about the lagoon. Then we have open marsh. Much of this meadow includes shrubs, alder, but then we also have cattail marsh and Phragmites marsh to a large extent now. But anyway, that's another part of this mosaic. Next slide. We have beach habitat out around the point itself. Next slide. And then we have an estuarine environment, if you will, where Wequiock Creek that drains the watershed up to the Niagara Escarpment, it flows into the bay right here and creates a floodplain that supports those wetlands that I just described. So we have here, in a relatively small area, a bunch of different habitats mixed together, somewhat reminiscent of the area that Bill described, really, and that provides, as we'll see, habitat for a great diversity of migratory birds. All right, so there's a mixture of habitats, but it's a mixture that's changing seasonally. In some cases, it changes daily with wind events and drainage from the creek, and then there are long-term fluctuations. So you'll see in some of these diagrams how dramatically this place has changed over just a matter of decades. So I think we're all aware around here about the fluctuations in the water levels of the Great Lakes. I don't really need to say very much about that, but it's well documented, and it certainly is manifest in the habitats at Point Sable. So here back in Early 1990s, that lagoon that I mentioned was full of water. Today, there is hardly any water there at all, just a tiny little pond that has remained, I guess, but we've replaced that with a wet meadow over most of that area. Next slide. So let's go back and document this in a little more detail. This is the earliest air photo that we have from 1938. It looks like most of this area was open sedge meadow, just little fingers of forest. There you can see the hunting camp out here. The beach was a bit more muddy than it was. Not many shrubs out here really at all. Next slide. By the 1960s, the water levels were higher. We see, I think, more extensive vegetation growth in that open area. The lagoon is filling up with water again. Beach is somewhat differently configured than it had been before. Next slide. Then in the early 1970s, we had an episode of high water levels. So here we're looking out toward the point. There's that lagoon, which is full of water. We've got all kinds of fingers of wetland penetrating this wet meadow area that we saw before. Next slide. And then that brings us back today, which is obviously a very low water period, and we have very much less wetland than we had before. All right, so superimposed on that natural dynamic is, of course, the dynamic that has come about as a result of the introduction of non-native species. So this is a view looking back toward Wequiak Creek from the bridge near the mouth of Wequiak Creek, taken in 1999. So the picture is taken right here. And you can see that we have cattails and sedges and other native vegetation primarily. Next slide. And here is a view from just about that same spot in 2011. And you can see that Phragmites australis has just taken over this area that has been drained largely from as a result of the low water levels in the bay. So we have a significant challenge here in dealing with invasive species. It's a dynamic system to begin with, and it probably always will be. So it's not going to be stable no matter what we do. But nevertheless, that makes it vulnerable and I guess ready-made for invasion by invasive plants as well as invasive animals, including Asian carp and zebra mussels and quagga mussels and the usual suspects here, I guess. All right, next slide. The beaches are an important habitat that provide resources for migratory shorebirds. They provide feeding areas for terns, and again, waterfowl still to this day are heavily concentrated in some of the bays and inlets and off the point itself. Again, the beaches also are being invaded by Phragmites, so that's another issue that compounds with what I've just described. All right, what about the birds? Well, I guess we're slackers. I know that more than 216 must be like 233 maybe, something like that. But anyway, the list of birds is really impressive at Point Sable. We've had students working there since the late 1990s, and I'm going to describe some of the results of that work here in just a few minutes. But the list includes bald eagles, which are nesting there now. We've had multiple nesting attempts. The last couple of years, they appear to have been successful. Shorebirds, water birds, waterfowl, and a very long list of land birds as well. And I'm going to be talking about the land birds here next. The studies there have included bird banding. We've been banding there since we acquired the property in late 1990s, and we've established a series of points where we've conducted standardized counts since 1999. Some of those studies are ongoing. Others, depending on students who are here at the time, we've had projects on specific aspects of the Point Au Sable environment. Next slide. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of those studies in a minute here. It also provides, just as the observatory near Milwaukee, it provides a wonderful opportunity for education. We have the upper left there, you can probably recognize Tom Scholz. That's a trip that Wisconsin Society for Ornithology took there during one of the conventions that we had here. We are able to take classes out to the point regularly. That person in the lower left is a very important visitor. That's Dr. David Coffrin, who really became excited about what we were doing as a result of a trip to Point Sable, and that's led to his family's very generous support of our scientific work here at UW Green Bay. Next slide. Some of our ongoing projects, we've begun to rejuvenate the banding program there. We're continuing to do point counts, again, depending on the availability of students. Stephanie Bielke, one of the co-authors of this work, is conducting a study there now, looking at some of the spatial and temporal dynamics of migratory birds at the site through banding and through point counts with the assistance of Nick and Aaron and Tom, who are also here. And one of the things that we're looking at is not just the numbers of species and the diversity of species, but the functional attributes of the species that visit Point Sable. At last summer's Ecological Society of America meetings in Portland, there must have been 20 or 30 papers dealing with functional diversity. Functional diversity is a way of looking at an assemblage or a community of organisms that looks at what they're actually doing, the role that they are filling in a community, and not just its identity. This is one of the applications of this idea that we've used to kind of illustrate what functional diversity is all about. We looked at the range of attributes, including size of the bird, the bill attributes, the length of the wing, and a number of different attributes that help us get an idea about how this bird lives, whether it's a foliage gleaner, a seed eater, or whatever. And this little diagram just illustrates the composition of the functional composition of our bird communities, here, in this case, in northern Wisconsin. Our hypothesis was because residents have to cope with the entire year's challenges of finding food and escaping from predation and so on, that the functional diversity of resident birds should be greater than that of migrants, which can come and exploit relatively short-term resources that are ephemeral and are present for only a short period of time, and then they can leave. And in fact, that's borne out very, very clearly. If you think about the winter birds here, they range from chickadees to woodpeckers, larger woodpeckers, yet the migrants are often the same size foliage gleaning birds, and the functional diversity of migrants is significantly lower than the functional diversity of residents. So that's one of the issues that Stephanie is going to be exploring, looking at how the succession of birds during the migration period relates to functional diversity, and whether there are in fact functional patterns in the birds visiting these different sites. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to talk now, I'm going to conclude by talking about the results of our point counts at these locations at Point Sable. So back in 1999, maybe it was 2000, but anyway, more than a decade ago, we established 10 permanent stations. We put a marker at these stations to make sure that observers went to the same spot, and we distributed them in these different habitats that I described. Nick and Aaron evaluated the distribution of our effort at those points, and not surprisingly, most of the point counts took place, have taken place during the peak of migration in both the spring and in the fall. That's when the place is more interesting. Certainly then it's not as interesting in the middle of the summer, it's not as interesting in January. So we have to account for that somehow, and that's one of the challenges that we've had to address in coming up with a way to standardize the effort so that we're looking at apples and comparing that to apples and not oranges. Next slide. Just a couple of additional slides here. If we look at the number of species over the years, that seems to correspond pretty well with our effort. So we have to be careful, again, about our comparisons. And Nick and Aaron did a species accumulation analysis looking at the number of species recorded given the addition of new counts. And we have reached kind of an asymptote here, but we can still use some assumptions and make a prediction that we aren't quite at the total number of species that we're likely to find there, but we're getting there. Okay, so effort is something we have to take into account, and I will take into account here in this next little analysis that I'll share with you. Go ahead. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 720 point counts distributed over a decade at different times of year and at these 11 points that I just described. So here are the 11 points, and here is the distribution of points and in different seasons. I'll define the seasons here in a couple of minutes. And you can see that points 10 and 11 got short-changed. They're in the wooded area here, and then in an area that really kind of overlaps with some other ones here. But that isn't going to affect the results here that I'm going to show. But for the most part, we have a good sample size from different seasons at each of those points when we combine the results over this 13-year sampling period. Next slide. All right, so I divided the timing of those observations into 15-day, roughly 15-day periods. I'm ignoring the winter. So winter, according to this definition, comes out to 4.5 months roughly. And the rest of the year then we can divide into 3 periods, spring, summer, and fall, which we can further divide into 15-day sub-periods. All right, so that's these are the time periods that you're going to see here. So spring actually is comprised of those 5 15-day periods, and so these counts were split up even more to help us get some idea about what we have, what the temporal variation of birds is over that period of time. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to just address 3 questions that I think we can answer with the data that we have available. So we have a bunch of bird surveys, all 10 minutes in duration. We have, our list is longer than the number that we actually got during the counts, because we did record birds that we saw when we were walking between counts, or just when somebody is out there doing a casual bird watch. But we're just talking about these standard 10-minute counts conducted at these points. So here are 3 questions that are of interest to us, and I think helping us understand how birds use one of these full-service hotel types of habitats. All right. So we can ask, how does the composition of these birds vary among points spatially? How do these assemblages vary among seasons? That's kind of a no-brainer. We know the answer to that generally, but we'll look at it quantitatively here, thanks to the information that has been collected. And then we can also ask, how do these assemblages vary within the spring, within the summer, and within the fall seasons? Okay, so that's broken down into those 15-day sub-periods that I just described. All right, so let's see what we come up with. Next slide. All right, so bear with me for a minute here, and I'll explain what this is all about. We, again, use the cumulative number of, we use the cumulative number of birds and divided it by the total number of counts to give us an average number of birds in a count within each of those categories. So we have an average number of birds counted per 10 minutes. Actually, I did it per 10-minute counts, so the numbers weren't all small fractions in many cases. But anyway, we have an average number of observations of birds at each point, at each period. And each of these symbols represents one point at one period. Okay? And they are distributed through a multivariate statistical technique called non-metric multidimensional scaling. But it's a method that puts assemblages that are like one another close together on this 2-dimensional map. So these 2 assemblages, this one was in the fall, this one was in the spring, but they had more or less the same birds there. That's why they're close together. All right? This one and this one were very different. They had very different birds there. So that's a way to visualize the variation in these assemblages here. Okay? So we can use this, this analysis to ask how variable are these bird assemblages among the different seasons. And something just stands out very clearly in this diagram. During the summer, you'll see most of the blue circles, which are the summer counts at these different points. During the summer, most of the counts are pretty close together. This one is a little aberrant, but the summer bird assemblage, which includes house wren and wood thrush and eastern wood pewee, and they tend to occur together, and we have less variation in the summer. We kind of knew that because all these migrants aren't here. But what I think is illustrated here, and bird watchers who spend a lot of time out during migration will I think agree that this makes sense. If we look at the spring, you'll see that the range of variation in the assemblages in the springtime is considerably less than the range of variation during the fall. So, one question that I think, the first question that we can answer, next slide, is how do bird assemblages vary among seasons? Species assemblages tend to be more variable during the fall. The fall migration as many of you know, is extended. It's a longer period of time, and the assemblages of birds that move through the fall tend to be more variable. Springtime, a little more predictable. So species assemblages are least variable during the summer, somewhat more variable, but still not maximally variable during the spring, and then wildly variable during the fall. And that's borne out by that analysis that I just showed you. Okay? So let's look at the second question. Next slide. Oops. Okay, good. So this question then is, how do these bird assemblages vary among points? So here we have our 11 points. This is the same set of information. It's just that I've overlain now the identity of the points. So here's point 8. Here, there's another sample at point 8, another one, another one, another one, another one, another one. Okay? So we see quite a bit of variation at that point. Let's just pick any point on here, point 5, and you'll see there are symbols all over the place. And just about every one of them is like that. So, next slide. Kind of make a long story short here. How do landbird assemblages, maybe I should have mentioned this. This analysis required a little bit of pre-treatment of the data. One of those things was to get rid of all the water birds so that, again, we weren't complicated by lesser scaup and water birds, and also very rare birds that just were present in less than 5 counts were also eliminated. So you have to do that to work out these kind of analyses. But anyway, so we're talking about land birds. And the point here from this analysis is that species assemblages are highly variable at virtually all of the points that we've sampled here. So you can't always predict what's going to show up at point 1 at any particular season. There's a great deal of unpredictability in this kind of environment. That would not necessarily be the case in a large contiguous forested habitat during the breeding season, certainly. But migratory bird assemblages are quite unpredictable, and even within an area such as this, where you have quite a bit of variation in habitat, the habitat doesn't help us out very much. The assemblages of birds are quite variable. And we also see that at a given point, pick up whatever you want, the boxes, or the blue circles, or whatever, there's a great deal of overlap. Again, telling us that at this full-service stopover site anyway, the birds are moving all over the place, and they're not paying a lot of attention to the habitat. They're using, as Dave mentioned this morning, they're opportunistic, I think, in using what's available at the time. Okay? And finally, the last question. How do these bird assemblages vary within season? So now we have 1 through 5 are in the spring, 11 through 15 are summer, 21 through 25 are in the fall. And you should notice here that there is much more of a pattern here. We see at period 4, for example, and again, these are points at different sites, but during, I don't remember what period 4 is, but that would be early May. The species assemblages are quite predictable. I think there's an outlier up here, but for the most part, quite predictable. Likewise, you again pick out any symbol here, and there's a cluster that's pretty close together. Next slide. So again, here I just circled the triangles, and you'll see again there's almost always an outlier somewhere. There's one there, but otherwise they're fairly tight. So that leads to the final conclusion here. Next slide. And that is significant variation within the seasons is evident. So there is more temporal predictability than there is spatial predictability in these bird assemblages. Okay, and again, the species composition at very different points at the same time is more likely to be similar than at the same point at different times. So the migration period, or the migration dynamic, if you will, that we hope to understand if we want to manage landscapes and habitats for birds has a very strong temporal component that we need to recognize, or we should recognize. Next slide. Okay, so here's the general conclusion from this really kind of first step analysis of these data. The patterns of variation over time are more consistent and predictable than variation spatially from one point to another, even in a fairly complex habitat like the one that we have at Point Sable. Okay, next slide. Now we've just looked at species assemblages here, but I can tell you that I've done a little bit of mining of the data to look at what's going on with individual species, and I'll give you a clue, I guess a hint that there are many really interesting things going on with some of these species. Baltimore oriole, for example, is very common at Point Sable during the springtime. During the fall, just about never occurs during fall. Now, I don't know whether the birds are just conspicuous, and that's something we have to try to understand, or whether, in fact, they migrate during late summer, which I think Baltimore orioles tend to do, and so we miss them during the fall. I'm not exactly sure what's going on, but very clear pattern. Brown-headed cowbird's another one. Very, very widely observed during the spring, not well observed in the fall, and that's probably because they engage in these great big flocks that you see around, and we don't get them regularly at Point Sable during that time. And there are many patterns like this that I think are going to be really interesting to explore to help us understand exactly how this migration dynamic is working, and whether that pattern that we get at Point Sable is going to be the same pattern that you guys get in Milwaukee will be another question that'll be, I think, really interesting to explore. Okay, last slide, I think.
Seems to be it.
Oh.
Yes.
Okay, well, there was one more in there that just said, what are the management implications of this? That's okay. It was just a picture of us burning Phragmites out at Point Sable. You can imagine. It was spectacular. But anyway, I don't have a good answer to that question. But if we are going to, I think, establish and develop a sophisticated management of these migratory stopover habitats and make decisions about management based on this knowledge, we have a lot of work to do. But I think studies like this, studies like the point counts you guys are doing, are going to help provide some of the answers to these questions.